Close your eyes now, and let us drift backward through the long corridors of time, through centuries that have folded and faded like old parchment, to a spring evening in the year 1516, in the small market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, where the river Avon runs quiet and silver beneath willow trees, and where William Shakespeare, 52 years old, lies in his bed in New Place, the second finest house in town, purchased with money earned from words and performances, and shares in a theatre company that made him modestly wealthy. His family is gathered close around him, his wife Anne, his daughter Judith, candles flickering against the wooden beams overhead, casting shadows that dance like memories across the ceiling. This is the moment history tells us he died, on the 23rd of April, St. George's Day, the same day he was born, a symmetry that poets and scholars would later find meaningful, inevitable, perfect. But tonight, in this version of Time, in this gentle alternative that we explore together in the darkness, something shifts, something changes in the fabric of his mortality, his breathing, which had grown shallow and labored through the afternoon, suddenly steadies and deepens. The fever that had burned through him for days breaks like a wave retreating from shore, and when dawn arrives, pale and silver and tentative through the window, touching the familiar objects of his room with new light, he opens his eyes once more, not to the darkness of death, not to whatever lies beyond, but to an impossible gift that he does not yet understand, cannot yet comprehend, will not fully realize for decades to come: immortality, endless continuation, a life that will not end. Though in this moment he simply feels stronger, clearer, as if some mysterious force within his body, within the very essence of whatever animates flesh and blood and thought, has decided, not yet, not now, not ever, and so begins a journey that will span 5 centuries and more, a single consciousness, a single witnessing mind, moving forward through the endless transformation of language and theatre and the very soul of storytelling itself, watching as the world he knew crumbles and is rebuilt and crumbles again. William Shakespeare, the man who gave the world Hamlet and Lear and Juliet and Macbeth and all those voices that still echo through our culture, will not rest in Trinity Church beneath a stone that warns against moving his bones. He will walk through the centuries to come, watching his words echo and mutate and transform, becoming something he never imagined, something stranger and more beautiful than any play he ever wrote. And we, in this quiet hour, as you drift towards sleep, will follow him gently, softly, through the strange and impossible future he never should have seen, through the world that grew from the seeds he planted, never knowing how far the branches would reach. In the years immediately following his recovery, that miraculous resurrection that no one speaks of because no one quite believes it happened, Shakespeare continues writing, though more cautiously now, moving quietly through the streets of London when he visits, avoiding too much attention from those who might remember him, might wonder why he looks so well, so unchanged. When other men his age are beginning to stoop and grey, he writes The Tempest again, or rather, he revises it endlessly, deepening Prospero's speeches, adding layers to the relationship between father and daughter, between master and servant, between vengeance and forgiveness, as if Prospero's final words, his promise to break his staff and drown his book, were never meant as farewell, were never meant for him at all. By 1620, most of his old friends and collaborators are gone, passed into the earth, their names recorded in parish registers and slowly fading from living memory. Richard Burbage, who first played Hamlet and Lear and Othello, who understood instinctively what Shakespeare was trying to do with those roles, dies in 1619, and Shakespeare attends the funeral quietly, standing in the back of the church, unrecognized. John Hemmings and Henry Condell, the faithful friends who will gather his plays into the first folio, are preparing that great work, that monument to a living man they believe will soon depart this world as all men do. But Shakespeare lingers, contributes secretly to the editing under various pretexts, watches his own canonization with a mixture of amusement and profound strangeness. He begins to notice, slowly at first and then with growing certainty, that something fundamental has changed. In his body, small wounds heal overnight. Illnesses that should fell him pass through like shadows, leaving no trace. By 1630, he understands with absolute clarity. He is not aging. Or if he is, the process has slowed to such a glacial pace that decades feel like months, that the accumulation of years leaves no visible mark. He makes a decision then, painful but necessary. He leaves England quietly, secretly, taking the name William Hall, identifying himself as a merchant, a traveller, a man of no particular importance. He watches from across the Channel as the English Civil War tears his country apart, sees the theatres closed by Cromwell's Puritans who declare all plays immoral, corrupting, dangerous to the soul. His works, the plays that audiences once flocked to see, are banned, silenced, forced underground. And he remembers the Globe Theatre, the wooden O where audiences stood packed together in the pit. The roar of the crowd when a scene landed perfectly. The smell of the Thames at low tide mixing with the scent of oranges and sweat and anticipation. The thrill of hearing his words spoken aloud, transformed by actors into something more than ink on paper. All of it now just memory, fading like candlelight in the dawn. But he does not despair, does not rage against this silencing. He simply watches, and waits, and writes in private, filling journals with observations and scenes and fragments of new plays that no one will ever perform. Knowing that time, which was once his greatest enemy, the force that limited how much he could write and see and experience, has become his greatest and most mysterious ally. By the beginning of the 18th century, Shakespeare has learned the delicate and necessary art of disappearing, of moving through the world without leaving traces, without drawing the kind of attention that might lead to questions he cannot answer. He spends decades in Paris, in Vienna, in Rome, moving between great cities of Europe, learning languages, attending the theatre whenever he can, watching how different cultures adapt and interpret the art of performance. He sees the French classical tradition at its height, watches Racine's tragedies performed with their strict adherence to unity of time and place and action, their elegant alexandrines and restrained emotions, and he watches Voltaire, that brilliant satirist, mock his plays as barbaric, as lacking in refinement and classical beauty, as crude English work that violates every rule of proper drama, and Shakespeare, sitting in the audience under yet another assumed name, smiles quietly to himself, because he knows that Voltaire does not understand, cannot understand, that the messiness, the chaos, the blood and laughter mixed together, the violation of unities and the mixing of high and low, that is life, that is truth, that is what theatre should capture, the way comedy and tragedy walk hand in hand through our days, the way a gravedigger can be funny even as he digs Ophelia's grave, the way Lear's madness can be both terrifying and heartbreaking and somehow, impossibly, illuminating. He attends performances of his own works in translation, watches them adapted and transformed and sometimes butchered and always reborn in German, in French, in Italian, in languages he is still learning. He sees Hamlet performed in an elaborate wig and breeches, speaking formal Alexandrines that bear little resemblance to the supple blank verse he wrote, and he thinks, "This is not what I wrote, not exactly, but perhaps it is what I meant, or what I might have meant if I had been born French. If I had lived in this time, if I had learned to think in these patterns." The plays are no longer his alone, he realizes. They belong to time now, to the future, to voices and cultures and interpretations he will never fully control or predict. And this thought, which might have troubled him once, brings him a strange peace. He writes new works in secret, filling leather-bound journals with sonnets and scenes and experimental fragments, trying new forms, new approaches, but he does not seek publication, does not try to stage them. What would be the point of revealing himself, of claiming authorship, when he is already immortal in the only way that truly matters, through the words he wrote when he was still mortal, still racing against time, still believing he had only a limited number of years to say everything he needed to say. Those words are still breathing, still alive on stages across the known world. And so he contents himself with watching, learning, absorbing. The evolution of dramatic art, reading Goethe and Racine and Molière with the attention of a student, and waiting, always waiting, for the next transformation, the next revolution in how stories are told. The 19th century arrives like a great wave breaking over Europe, and with it comes a fever for Shakespeare unlike anything he has ever witnessed in all his wandering years. He is in London again, drawn back to his native country after decades abroad, appearing now as a man of perhaps 40 years, his face settled into that age as if frozen there, a mask he cannot remove no matter how many decades pass. He walks past statues of himself erected in public squares, sees his imagined face, rendered in bronze and marble by sculptors who never knew him, who are working from their imagination of what England's greatest poet must have looked like. He attends performances at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, at Covent Garden, watches actors like Edmund Kean and Sarah Siddons weep and rage and whisper their way through his lines, investing them with emotions he never quite intended but which somehow work, somehow reveal new depths in words he wrote 2 centuries before. Audiences gasp at Macbeth's ambition, weep over Ophelia's madness, laugh at Falstaff's wit, as if encountering these characters for the first time, as if they were brand new despite being older than anyone living. The Romantic movement has claimed him as their spiritual ancestor, their proof that genius transcends rules and reason. Coleridge writes elaborate essays dissecting his genius, analyzing the psychology of his characters with an intensity that Shakespeare finds both flattering and slightly absurd. Hazlitt lectures on his plays, calling him a god among poets, a universal mind, someone who understood all of human nature, and Shakespeare, standing in the back of the theatre in a coat he purchased from a shop on Bond Street, feels a strange and profound loneliness washing over him like cold water, because they are worshipping a ghost, a phantom, a version of William Shakespeare who never truly existed. They have created a myth of the perfect poet, the universal genius, the man who knew everything about human nature, and that man, that impossible figure, is not him, not the real person who struggled with every line, who wrote bad passages and then tried to fix them, who borrowed plots from other sources because he couldn't think of his own, who probably misspelled his own name because spelling wasn't standardized and he didn't think it mattered much. That flawed, uncertain, human William Shakespeare has been forgotten, erased, replaced by this towering marble figure. He tries, in his own small way, to push back against the myth. He writes letters to newspapers under false names, arguing that perhaps Shakespeare was just a man, talented but human, flawed in his work and in his life. But no one listens. No one wants to hear it. The myth is too powerful, too necessary, too comforting. People need their heroes to be perfect, their geniuses to be godlike. And so he lets it continue, lets it grow, watching from the shadows as his own complicated, messy, human life becomes a simplified fiction. In the year 1871, Shakespeare books passage on a steamship and sails to America, to the new world that was barely colonized when he was born, that existed only as a distant rumor of forests and indigenous peoples and Spanish settlements. The voyage takes 2 weeks, and he stands on deck watching the Atlantic roll beneath him, thinking of Prospero's island, of the sea change that transforms and renews. He arrives in New York City, walks the bustling streets of Manhattan, sees buildings rising higher than anything in London, sees crowds speaking a dozen languages, sees theatres advertising Richard III and much ado about nothing alongside melodramas and variety shows and performances he doesn't quite understand. He buys a ticket to see Othello, sits in the balcony of a grand theatre on Broadway, listens to American accents twist and reshape his iambic pentameter into something new, something vital, something that shouldn't work but somehow does. The actor playing Othello emphasizes different words than an English actor would, finds different rhythms in the lines, and Shakespeare realizes the language has changed, is changing, will keep changing forever and ever. The English he wrote, the English of Elizabeth and James, is already archaic, already requiring footnotes and glossaries for modern audiences, and yet the stories remain. The fundamental human experiences of jealousy and ambition and love and revenge, the human heart in conflict with itself, as alive now as they were when he first imagined them. He takes a train westward, one of those new transcontinental railways that have only recently been completed, sits in a passenger car watching the vast empty plains roll past, sees buffalo herds and mountains rising like ancient gods in the distance, and he thinks of King Lear raging on the heath, of Prospero commanding his island, of all the landscapes in his plays. They were all England, small and green and contained, bounded by the sea. But this American vastness, these spaces that seem to go on forever, this is a stage he never imagined, a scale of geography that dwarfs his small island nation. He settles for a time in San Francisco, that gold rush city perched on hills overlooking the Pacific, and takes a position teaching literature at a small college under the name William Ashford, professor of English literature. His students struggle with the sonnets, complain that Shakespeare is boring, too old-fashioned, too difficult to understand. Why can't they read something modern? And he laughs softly, gently, trying not to let them see how much this amuses him, because they are absolutely right. He thinks, the words are old, the language is difficult, the cultural references are obscure, but the truths beneath them, the human experiences they describe, those are eternal, those haven't changed at all. The 20th century arrives like a thunderclap, like a revolution in how human beings experience reality itself. And Shakespeare, now moving through the world as a mild-mannered scholar named William Ashford, witnesses the birth of a new art form that will transform storytelling more radically than anything since the invention of the printing press: cinema, moving pictures, stories told in light and shadow, and the rapid succession of images. He attends one of the first screenings of a Shakespeare adaptation in 1908, a short silent film of Hamlet, watches the flickering black and white images of the ghost appearing through double exposure, watches Hamlet's famous soliloquies reduced to intertitle cards that audiences read silently while a piano player provides emotional music, and he is simultaneously horrified and mesmerized. Because this is theatre without living breath, without the physical presence of actors in the same room as the audience, without that electric connection between performer and spectator that has defined drama since the ancient Greeks, and yet it captures something he always wanted, always reached for in his stage directions and his language: the ability to show rather than merely tell, to visualize the interior landscape of thought, to move instantly between locations without the awkward conventions of the stage. He begins, tentatively at first, to write screenplays, adapting his own plays for this new medium, submitting them under various pseudonyms to studios in Hollywood and London. Most are rejected, a few are optioned and then never produced. One or two are actually made but altered beyond recognition by directors and producers who think they know better. He learns the new grammar of film, the language of cuts and close-ups and montage, reads the theories of Eisenstein and Pudovkin, watches the early masterpieces of D.W. Griffith, and then later the sound films that add voices and music. He watches Laurence Olivier's Hamlet in 1948, sees how Olivier uses camera movement and deep focus and voiceover to create a cinematic language specifically for Shakespeare. He watches Orson Welles' Othello and Chimes at Midnight, sees how Welles fragments and rearranges the text to create something that works on screen. He watches Akira Kurosaw's Throne of Blood and Ran, his stories refracted through Japanese culture and aesthetics, samurai replacing kings, Buddhist philosophy replacing Christian theology, and somehow the essential truths remaining intact. And he begins to understand something profound, that his stories are not tied to his language, not really. They can be translated, transformed, relocated, reimagined, and still retain their power. They have become something larger than the specific words he wrote, larger than the culture that produced them. They have become myths, archetypes, fundamental human patterns that each generation can claim and remake in their own image. By the turbulent, revolutionary 1960s, Shakespeare has become a kind of ghost in his own legacy, a phantom wandering through the consequences of his work. He walks through university campuses during protests against the Vietnam War, listens to students and professors debate the authorship question, argue passionately about whether William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, that grain merchant's son with limited education, could possibly have written such sophisticated plays. Perhaps it was really Christopher Marlowe, faking his death and writing in secret, or Francis Bacon, encoding secret knowledge in the plays, or the Earl of Oxford, needing a front man to publish his aristocratic wisdom. And Shakespeare finds this deeply, absurdly funny, in a way that he cannot share with anyone, because the greatest literary mystery in the English language, the question that has spawned countless books and theories and passionate arguments, could be solved if he simply stood up and said, "It was me. I'm right here. I wrote them." But of course he cannot, will not. The revelation would raise more questions than it answered. He attends Stratford-upon-Avon for the 400th anniversary of his birth in 1964, stands among the massive crowds gathered to celebrate, listens to speeches about his eternal genius, his immortal contribution to human culture, and he feels nothing, or rather, he feels a curious numbness, a distance, as if he is watching someone else's life being celebrated, someone else's achievement being praised. No pride, no satisfaction, just a quiet distance, as if his past self were a character he once played and has now forgotten. He begins teaching again, this time at a community college in Berkeley, California, during the height of the counterculture movement. His students have long hair and wear tie-dyed shirts and question all authority, all tradition, everything their parents believed, and yet, fascinatingly, wonderfully, they love Shakespeare. They see Hamlet as a rebel against corrupt authority, see Juliet as a woman trapped by patriarchal structures, see Prospero as a colonial oppressor imposing his will on Caliban, the indigenous inhabitant. They are rewriting his work in their minds, interrogating it, challenging it, finding in it reflections of their own political awakening. And he is amazed, delighted even, because this is exactly what theatre should be, what art should be, not reverence, not worship, not passive reception, but engagement, argument, transformation, making the old new by viewing it through the lens of the present moment. He writes a scholarly paper suggesting that Shakespeare's plays are intentionally incomplete, that they require each generation to finish them, to make them new, to discover in them whatever that generation needs to discover. And this time, surprisingly, people listen. The paper gets published, gets cited, becomes part of the ongoing conversation about how we should approach these ancient texts. The late 20th century brings technologies and possibilities that Shakespeare, for all his imagination, never dreamed could exist. Personal computers that put vast libraries of information at people's fingertips. The internet connecting minds across continents instantaneously. The digitization of every text he ever wrote, every performance ever recorded, all available at the click of a button by the mid-1990s. Shakespeare, now appearing as a grey-haired man of perhaps 50. 5. Teaching at a community college in Portland, Oregon, sits in a computer lab and realizes that his complete works are available online, free to anyone with an internet connection. A teenager in Tokyo can read Romeo and Juliet at the same moment as a student in Mumbai, a retired teacher in Sao Paulo, a young actor in Lagos. The democratization of his words, the globalizing of his stories, happening at a speed and scale he could never have imagined when he was carefully writing out manuscripts by candlelight in his lodgings in London. He creates a website under a pseudonym, one of those early, simple websites with basic HTML, offering modern English translations of his plays, trying to make them accessible to people who struggle with the archaic language. And immediately he is attacked by purists, by Shakespeare scholars who accuse him of destroying the beauty and music of the original language, of dumbing down the work, of committing a kind of cultural vandalism. He does not respond to these attacks, does not defend himself. He simply continues the work, because he knows something they do not, that language must evolve or die, that if his plays can only be appreciated by people with graduate degrees in English literature, then they are already dead, already museum pieces rather than living theatre. He watches film adaptations multiply and diversify. Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet with its guns and gang warfare and modern music, young beautiful actors speaking his 400-year-old words against a backdrop of swimming pools and neon signs and MTV-style editing. And he thinks, yes, this is exactly right. This is what I would have done if I were young now, if I were trying to reach a modern audience. The words matter less than the emotion, the connection, the fundamental truth of young love and its destruction by the senseless. Feuds of the older generation. He sees his plays performed in American Sign Language, in hip-hop with the iambic pentameter transformed into rap rhythms, in all-female productions and all-male productions and everything in between. And he realizes, finally, completely, that his greatest achievement was not writing perfect, unchangeable plays. It was writing plays that could survive imperfection, adaptation, transformation, endless reinvention by people who would never know him, who would bring to his work their own experiences, their own pain, their own questions, their own answers. In the early years of the 21st century, as the new millennium unfolds with its terrorist attacks and wars and financial crises and social upheavals, Shakespeare begins to write again in earnest, not plays this time, not sonnets in the Elizabethan style, but something new, something suited to this connected age. He writes essays and blog posts and tweets, all under various pseudonyms, none traceable to William Ashford or any of his other identities. He engages with the Shakespeare authorship controversy online, sometimes defending the historical Shakespeare, sometimes arguing against him, sometimes proposing absurd new candidates just to watch the theories multiply, delighting in the chaos of it all. He watches the rise of prestige television, the so-called golden age of serialized storytelling, shows like The Sopranos and The Wire and Breaking Bad and Mad Men, and he sees, with growing excitement, that television has become what he always wanted theatre to be. Long-form storytelling that can develop characters over dozens of hours, that can show the full complexity of human nature, the way villains can be sympathetic and heroes can be deeply flawed, the way people contain multitudes and contradictions. Tony Soprano is a brutal murderer and a loving father. Walter White transforms from victim to villain over the course of years. These characters are Shakespearean in their complexity, in their refusal to be simple or one-dimensional. He writes a pilot script for a historical drama, sends it to HBO under a pseudonym. It is rejected with a polite form letter, and he laughs out loud in his small apartment. Because even immortality and 400 years of experience do not guarantee success in the brutal world of television development, he attends a performance of Hamilton in New York in 2015, that revolutionary musical that reimagines the American founding through hip-hop and colorblind casting, that makes the dead founding fathers young and vital and relevant to a modern multiracial audience. And he weeps, sitting in the theatre with tears running down his face, because this is what theatre should be, what he always tried to make it, immediate, vital, speaking directly to the moment while honoring the past, using whatever forms and languages and rhythms the audience understands. He writes a letter to Lin-Manuel Miranda afterward, never sends it, says in the unsent letter, "You have done what I tried to do in my time. You have made history sing. You have made the dead speak in voices the living can hear. You have proven that old stories can be new if you tell them with enough passion and invention." By the year 2015, Shakespeare is living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, in that neighborhood of artists and writers and young people trying to make their mark on the world, and he works as a dramaturg at a tiny experimental theatre company, one of those scrappy off-Broadway operations that can barely afford to keep the lights on. He is known as Will Ashford now, a kind and slightly eccentric old man with an inexplicable and encyclopedic knowledge of Elizabethan theatre history, who helps young playwrights develop their work, reads their scripts with careful attention, offers gentle suggestions that somehow always improve the piece without imposing his own vision, and sometimes, late at night after rehearsals, over cheap beer in dive bars in Williamsburg, he tells stories about what theatre was like in the 1590s, and his young collaborators assume he is speaking metaphorically, academically, using the historical present tense the way scholars do. They have no idea he was actually there, that he remembers the smell of the thatched roof of the Globe on a summer day, remembers the exact timbre of Richard Burbage's voice when he laughed. He watches the rise of virtual reality and augmented reality, the possibility of immersive theatre where the audience doesn't just watch the story but becomes part of it, makes choices that affect the outcome, and he thinks of the Globe Theatre, where the groundlings stood right up against the stage, where the line between audience and performer was always blurred and negotiable, where actors could address the crowd directly and the crowd could shout back. Perhaps technology is simply bringing us back to something ancient and fundamental. He thinks, the desire to be inside the story rather than outside it. He sees productions of his plays where the actors are holograms, where artificial intelligences have been programmed to speak his words with perfect meter and pronunciation, and he wonders, lying awake at 3 in the morning in his small bed, whether a machine can truly perform Hamlet, whether it can feel Hamlet's doubt and paralysis and existential terror, or whether feeling is not actually the point, whether perhaps the point has always been the words themselves, the patterns of sound and meaning, independent of the flesh that speaks them. And if that's true, then what is he? What has he been all these centuries? Just a container for patterns, a vessel for language, no different in principle from an AI trained on his texts. The late 2010s brings something Shakespeare never anticipated, never imagined even in his wildest flights of fancy. The rise of artificial intelligence capable of generating original text, of writing poetry and plays in various styles, of imitating human creativity with uncanny accuracy. He sits in a library in Brooklyn and reads a sonnet composed by an AI system that was trained on his complete works, fed every word he ever wrote, and then asked to produce something new in his style. And the sonnet is good, not great, not genius, but competent, even occasionally clever. It captures the rhythm, the structure, the kind of wordplay he favored. But it lacks something essential, something he can feel but cannot quite name, perhaps soul, perhaps the sense of a specific human consciousness wrestling with language, failing, trying again, discovering something unexpected in the act of creation. He begins to wonder about his own immortality in new ways, asking questions he has never asked before. If machines can write like Shakespeare, if they can generate endless variations on Shakespearean themes and forms, then what does it mean to be Shakespeare? Is he just a collection of patterns, of linguistic habits and tendencies, replicable by a sufficiently advanced algorithm given enough training data? Or is there something else, something that cannot be copied or simulated? Something unique to the experience of being this particular consciousness, of carrying memories that no one else carries, of having lived through 5 centuries of history, of having watched the world transform again and again and again, He writes a one-act play about an immortal poet who realizes that his immortality is meaningless because everything he could ever write has already been written by predictive text algorithms. He stages it at his small theater in Brooklyn on a cold February night. 6 people attend. Scattered across the 60-seat house, 3 of them fall asleep during the performance, and afterward, standing outside in the snow, he thinks, "This is perfect. This is what theatre has always been, intimate, imperfect, alive in the moment and then gone forever, leaving no trace except in the memories of the few people who were there." The year 2020 arrives, and with it comes a plague, a global pandemic that shuts down theatres around the world, that forces humanity into isolation and separation, that changes how we live and gather and share experiences. Shakespeare, living alone now in his Brooklyn apartment, watches as theatre companies scramble to adapt, streaming performances from empty auditoriums, actors performing to cameras instead of audiences. He watches a production of Hamlet performed over Zoom, the actors each in their own little box on screen, the ghost appearing as a glitchy freeze frame, connection problems causing speeches to cut out mid-sentence. And he thinks about the plague years of his own time, when the theatres in London were closed by law, when the acting companies had to tour the countryside, performing in yards and great halls, anywhere they could find an audience. Theatre has always adapted, has always found ways to survive. And yet this feels different, more fundamental, because the essential thing, the thing that defines theatre, the gathered audience sharing the same physical space with the performers, breathing the same air, experiencing the same moment together, that is gone, perhaps, temporarily, perhaps forever. He writes a short play designed specifically for Zoom, a two-hander about isolation and the longing for connection, 2 characters who can see and hear each other but cannot touch. It is performed once, by 2 actors in different countries, one in New York and one in London. And afterward he receives an email from someone who watched, a stranger, saying simply, "Thank you. This made me feel less alone tonight." And he sits looking at that message for a long time, feeling something warm and painful in his chest. Because that is all theatre ever needed to do. That is the only thing that ever mattered, to make someone feel less alone, even for a moment, even across centuries and continents and the vast distance between one human soul and another. As the world slowly, tentatively reopens, as vaccines become available and people begin gathering again, Shakespeare walks through Times Square in the summer of 2021, sees the digital billboards advertising the return of Broadway, the resurrection of live performance after the longest shutdown in theatre history. He buys a ticket to a revival of King Lear, sits in the orchestra section of a grand theatre, watches an 83-year-old actor howl against the storm, rage against the dying of the light, embody the terrible vulnerability of age and madness, and he is moved in a way he has not been moved in decades, perhaps centuries, because this actor understands something profound. That Lear is not just about political power and family betrayal and madness. It is about aging, about the body betraying the mind, about losing control, about the terror of being forgotten and abandoned and irrelevant. And Shakespeare, who has not aged significantly in more than 400 years, who has forgotten what it feels like to fear death or diminishment, who will never experience the slow decline that awaits every mortal human. He envies this actor, envies everyone in the audience, all of them mortal, all of them racing toward an ending they cannot escape, because their lives have shape, have meaning derived from their brevity, have the tragic beauty of something that will end. He writes in his journal that night, sitting at his kitchen table in Brooklyn at 2 in the morning. Immortality is not a gift, it is a sentence, a curse, to watch everyone you love die again and again, to see the world change beyond all recognition, to become a stranger in your own legacy, to carry memories that no one else shares, to be always and forever alone. But then he crosses it out, draws a line through the words, because it is not entirely true, not the whole truth. Immortality has also given him something precious and strange, the ability to see his stories survive and grow and change, to watch them matter to people he will never meet, people not yet born, people in futures he cannot imagine, and that, perhaps, is worth the loneliness, worth the endless accumulation of loss. By the year 2022, Shakespeare has become interested in video games, that newest form of interactive storytelling, and he spends hours playing a game called Elsinore, where the player controls Ophelia, reliving the same day over and over in a time loop, trying to prevent the tragedy of Hamlet, trying to save everyone from their fates. And he is astonished, delighted, amazed by this, because it is a completely new way of experiencing his story, not as a passive observer sitting in an audience, but as an active participant making choices, changing outcomes, discovering that small decisions can ripple outward and transform everything. He wonders what it would be like to create a game from scratch, an interactive story where the player becomes the protagonist, where the narrative branches and splits based on their choices. He begins learning programming, slowly and patiently, taking online courses, struggling with syntax and logic, making beginner mistakes. But he has time, all the time in the world, and gradually he improves. He collaborates with a small independent game studio, 3 people working out of a shared apartment in Oakland, and together they design a narrative game based on The Tempest. The player is Prospero, choosing whether to forgive or take revenge, whether to free Ariel or keep him enslaved, whether to educate Miranda about the world beyond the island or keep her innocent. The game is released to modest reviews on Steam and gaming websites. Some critics praise its literary quality and moral complexity. Others complain that it is too slow, too text-heavy, not enough action or gameplay, and Shakespeare thinks, reading these reviews with a cup of coffee in his hand. Yes, this is the eternal tension, the question that never goes away no matter what medium you work in, the balance between art and entertainment, between what the audience wants and what the creator needs to say, between accessibility and integrity. He has been navigating this tension for 500 years, since he first started writing plays for paying audiences at the Globe, and it never gets easier. The answer is never clear. In the spring of 2023, Shakespeare receives an invitation to attend a special performance, a groundbreaking production featuring an entirely AI-generated cast, holographic actors created through advanced motion capture technology, their movements based on decades of recordings of great Shakespearean performers, their voices synthesized from thousands of hours of audio. He arrives at the theater in Manhattan, sits in the middle of the orchestra section, watches as the lights dim and the performance begins. It is Hamlet, and the hologram playing the prince is based on Laurence Olivier's famous portrayal. The ghost is John Gielgud. Ophelia is Judi Dench as she appeared in her youth, and it is technically perfect, astonishingly realistic. The holograms move with grace and precision. Their timing is impeccable, every gesture meaningful, every line delivered with clarity and emotion. And yet Shakespeare feels a growing uneasiness, a discomfort that intensifies as the performance continues, because there is something missing, something essential. These holograms cannot fail, cannot forget a line, cannot respond to the energy of the audience, cannot have an unexpected moment of inspiration. They can only repeat endlessly the performance they were programmed to give. Theatre, he realizes sitting there in the dark, is not about perfection. It is about risk, about the possibility of failure, about the live and unrepeatable moment when anything might happen. It is about mortality, about the knowledge that this performance will never come again exactly like this, that we are all, actors and audience alike, moving through time together toward an ending. And these holograms, for all their sophistication, have no mortality, no risk, no real presence. They are recordings pretending to be alive. He leaves at intermission, walks out into the cool night air, and thinks, I have been alive for 609 years. I am more like those holograms than I am like the people around me. I am a recording of a person who lived long ago, playing and replaying the same patterns, and the thought fills him with an aching sadness he cannot name. In the autumn of 2024, Shakespeare receives an invitation in his email, an automated message asking if he would like to speak at a conference on the future of storytelling in the age of artificial intelligence. He declines. As he always declines such invitations, he does not give lectures or seek any kind of public attention, but he attends as an observer, registering under a pseudonym. Sitting in the back row of a hotel conference room in San Francisco, he listens to futurists and technologists and media executives describe a coming world where stories will be tailored to each individual viewer, where AI will analyze your preferences and viewing history and psychological profile and generate narratives designed specifically and uniquely for you, personalized stories that no one else will ever experience, optimized for your particular tastes and needs. And as he listens, Shakespeare feels something like horror creeping over him, because this is the opposite of everything he tried to do, everything he believed about the purpose of storytelling. He wanted to write stories that belonged to everyone, that meant different things to different people but were still shared, still part of a common culture, still something you could talk about with your neighbors and friends and strangers. The idea of a story experienced by only one person, never discussed, never debated, never argued over or interpreted differently by different minds. It feels profoundly lonely to him, feels like the death of something essential. During the question and answer session, he raises his hand, asks, if a story is only ever experienced alone, tailored perfectly to one person's preferences, never shared or discussed or interpreted differently by different people, is it still a story, or is it just a very sophisticated dream, a hallucination? The panelists look confused, try to answer but miss his point entirely. They talk about user engagement metrics and content optimization and personalized experiences, and he realizes they are speaking a completely different language now, the language of data and algorithms and market segmentation, not the language of theatre, of shared human experience, of the collective imagination. By the middle of 2025, Shakespeare is tired in a way that has nothing to do with his body, which never tires, which still functions with the vitality of middle age despite the 609 years that have passed since his birth in Stratford-upon-Avon. He is tired spiritually, emotionally, tired of watching and witnessing and remembering. He has seen his plays performed in every conceivable style, in every language with a written script, in every medium from intimate theatre to global streaming platforms. He has watched the world transform beyond anything he could have imagined, watched theatre evolve from a simple wooden stage to holographic projections and virtual reality. And he wonders, sitting alone in his apartment on a grey winter afternoon, what is left to see? What more could possibly surprise him? What reason does he have to continue? He considers disappearing entirely, going somewhere remote and unpopulated, Alaska or Patagonia or some small island in the Pacific, living out his immortality in silence and solitude, letting the world forget William Ashford just as it has forgotten all his other identities. But then, as he is seriously contemplating this, he receives an email from a student, a high school student in Lagos, Nigeria, whom he has never met. The student explains that they have adapted Macbeth into a science fiction story, set on a space station in the year 2200, with the Weird Sisters reimagined as malfunctioning artificial intelligences who feed Macbeth false predictions. And the student is asking for permission to perform this adaptation at their school. Shakespeare, using his William Ashford email, writes back immediately, "You do not need my permission. The story belongs to you now, belongs to everyone. Do with it what you will. I hope your performance goes wonderfully." And the student writes back the next day, "Thank you so much. I wanted to tell you that this play saved my life last year. I was in a very dark place and was thinking about ending things. But reading about Macbeth's guilt and his inability to escape the consequences of his choices, it showed me that recognizing your mistakes is a kind of courage, that it's possible to face what you've done and still choose to keep living." Shakespeare sits staring at this message on his screen for a long time, reading it again and again, and he thinks, this is why I am still here, not to see perfect productions of my plays, not to watch them performed with impeccable technique by the finest actors, but to see them used, to see them help someone somewhere make sense of their life, survive another day, feel less alone in their suffering. In the spring of 2026, Shakespeare walks through Central Park on an early morning in April, when mist is rising from the grass and the city is still mostly quiet, when joggers run past on the paths and dog walkers let their animals roam free, and the homeless sleep on benches under donated blankets. He thinks about all the different versions of himself that have existed across these 6 centuries. The young man desperate for success who came to London from Stratford with nothing but ambition and a facility with language, the middle-aged playwright at the height of his powers, writing Lear and Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra in a white heat of creativity, the immortal wanderer watching his words outlive empires and religions and entire ways of life, and he wonders which one is the real William Shakespeare, or whether they are all equally real, all equally him, or whether he is none of them anymore, whether he has become something else entirely. He sits on a bench near the Bethesda fountain, watches the early morning light touch the angel statue, and thinks about Jock's famous speech from As You Like It, the one about the 7 ages of man, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. He wrote that more than 400 years ago, and it is still true, still captures something essential about human existence. We are all performing, all trying on different roles, hoping one of them will fit, will feel authentic, will allow us to be whoever we think we should be, except he has played too many parts, worn too many masks, lived too many lives, and he has forgotten which one was supposed to be real. He pulls out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, begins writing in pen, not planning what he will say, just letting the words flow. What is a story? What is a life? What is the difference between remembering and imagining? And as he writes, he feels something he has not felt in decades, perhaps in centuries, the thrill of genuine uncertainty, of not knowing where the words will lead, of discovering something in the act of writing rather than simply recording what he already knows. As summer arrives in New York City, bringing heat and humidity and the smell of hot concrete and food carts, Shakespeare begins teaching again, leading a workshop for young playwrights at a community center in the Bronx, a program funded by a small arts grant and staffed by volunteers. His students are mostly teenagers, children of immigrants from the Dominican Republic and Mexico and Bangladesh and Ghana, many of them speaking English as their second or third language, all of them carrying stories from worlds Shakespeare only dimly understands, and they write with such intensity, such urgency, such fury, plays about police violence and gentrification and climate change and deportation and family and identity, and what it means to belong somewhere when the place you came from no longer exists and the place you live in does not fully accept you. He reads their work carefully, offers notes and suggestions. Perhaps this character needs a moment of vulnerability. Perhaps this scene is telling us something that could be shown instead. Perhaps this ending is too neat. Life is messier than this. And they listen sometimes, absorbing his feedback, and sometimes they ignore him completely, following their own instincts, trusting their own voices, and he is proud of them when they ignore him, when they defend their choices, when they insist that their vision matters more than his experience, because they are not writing like him. They are writing like themselves, bringing their own lives and languages and rhythms and concerns to the ancient art of playwriting. And that is exactly what should happen. What must happen if theatre is to remain alive and relevant? His plays will survive. He knows this with absolute certainty now, not because they are perfect or universal or timelessly relevant, but because they are open, flexible, adaptable, capable of being interrogated and challenged and transformed by each new generation, and as long as human beings need stories to make sense of their lives, to process their pain and joy and confusion, to share their experiences with others, his words will continue to echo, changed and mutated and barely recognizable, but still somehow essentially themselves. And now, as another season turns, as autumn light slants golden through the windows of his small Brooklyn apartment, touching the books and papers scattered across his desk, William Shakespeare sits in his chair looking out over the city, watching the light change as afternoon becomes evening. He is still here, still alive, still witnessing the endless flow of time. He does not know what the future holds, cannot predict where storytelling will go next, what new technologies and mediums and forms will emerge in the decades and centuries to come. But he knows, with the certainty of someone who has watched the world transform again and again, that stories will continue, will adapt, will find new vessels and new voices. As long as there are human beings, there will be stories about what it means to be human, about love and death and power and longing and the mystery of consciousness, the strangeness of being alive and aware and trapped in these mortal bodies. Or in his case, this mysteriously immortal one, and his stories, the ones he wrote so long ago in a language that is already halfway to being a dead language, studied in schools like Latin or ancient Greek. They will be part of that continuing conversation. Ghosts from the past speaking to the future, asking the same questions generation after generation. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we owe to each other? How should we live? What happens when we die? And perhaps that is the real meaning of immortality, not living forever in your own body, but creating something that helps others live, that gives them tools to understand their own experiences, that connects them across time and space and culture. And so William Shakespeare continues, moving forward through time, a quiet witness to the endless evolution of the human story, still learning new things every day, still surprised by the creativity and resilience of each new generation, still watching and wondering and writing in his private notebooks, waiting to see what happens next in this great ongoing drama. And the answer, as always, is written not in the past but in the moments yet to come, in the breath before the curtain rises on a new performance, in the silence before the first word is spoken, in the infinite possibility of what we might discover about ourselves if we keep telling stories, if we keep listening to each other, if we keep imagining different ways to live, different futures, different endings. And so the story continues, as it always has, as it always will, flowing forward like a river that never stops, carrying us all toward an unknown destination, toward a future where perhaps his plays will still be performed, or perhaps they will have transformed into something unrecognizable, or perhaps they will have been forgotten entirely and replaced by new stories, new myths, new ways of making sense of this strange and beautiful and terrifying experience we call being alive. And he is at peace with that uncertainty, that not knowing, because he has learned, across 609 years of continuous existence, that the beauty is not in the destination but in the journey, not in the ending but in the endless middle, not in final answers but in questions that keep unfolding, generation after generation, inviting us to look more deeply, to feel more honestly, to imagine more boldly. And as the light fades and evening comes to the city, he picks up his pen once more and begins to write, not knowing what he will say, simply trusting that the words will come as they always have, that the act of putting language on paper is itself a kind of magic, a way of making meaning from chaos, of building bridges between one consciousness and another across the vast darkness. And in that moment, sitting there in the gathering dark, he is the same person he was 400 years ago in Stratford and London, still driven by the same mysterious compulsion to turn experience into language, to make the invisible visible, to capture something of what it means to be human and share it with whoever might be listening. And the story goes on.